So this week, what we're doing is we're introducing bilingualism as a broader category. This class is called Two Languages, One Mind because bilingualism, as we'll see in a second, has lots of definitions, the term bilingual. Like if someone's highly proficient in L2, some people will be like, oh, you're bilingual, right? Whereas someone else, and then they'll say, no, of course not, right? It's very much how you define it. However, the idea of two languages, one mind, the reason the course is called this is because there is something about the coexistence of two languages in your brain that kind of has some parallelisms. Okay. However, it is, this course we spend so much time talking about L2 as opposed to other types of bilingualism that I think we sometimes we lose scope, and I think we do need to zoom out a little bit and allow ourselves to look at what happens when you learn it earlier. Importantly, today we got to talk about terminology because there are a lot of words that fall under this umbrella, right? So even so, I'm going to show you some bullet points with categorizations, and they're all going to have their own slides, but you'll see that there's a bunch of different ways to look at the word bilingual. The simultaneous versus sequential version, early versus late, bimodality, heritage, so-called balanced bilinguals. And different researchers tend to use one of these and not the others. Depends on what group you pertain to. So let's take a look at them because we have to kind of pick some to use. So for example, the term simultaneous versus sequential, this is usually a sociolinguistic term. I'm not saying always, but simultaneous tends to be the word that gets thrown around for people who learn both languages between 0 and 2. And usually those people are someone who, within their literal nuclear family, whoever's in the household with them, their guardians. Usually it's one guardian speaks or signs one language and one guardian speaks or signs the other. These are considered simultaneous bilinguals. Given that a lot of bilingualism arises due to immigration, these are probably not the most common group of bilinguals, but they do for sociolinguistics because there's something about being bicultural like that, hold a very special status. And so then everybody else gets called sequential, right? You learn one and then you start the other. Another would be early versus late, and this is a term that gets used if people want to do the L2 learner versus heritage learner, that is to say, 0 to 6 versus adulthood learners. Adulthood is the L2, right? If people who want to compare those two groups, especially cognitive SLAers, like early versus late, I've thrown it around in my writing from time to time because it's hard to always write. Because if I write heritage versus L2, I have to it's a useful shorthand in certain circles. But what it tends to mean is early bilinguals are people who learned it before the critical period, and late is after. And when I say here cognitive SLAers, it is a very popular term in those circles, especially psycholinguistics really likes early versus late. So again, early tends to be 0 to 6, and late tends to be 7 or later. I think usually these people tend to skip kind of the 7 through 13 or 7 through 16 range, just to be really clear, like pre-critical, post-critical. But this definition does typically allow for 0 to 6 and then 7 and after. Child bilinguals in like the 7 to 12 range are a really fun special group. They tend to get the most balanced between the two languages, and we'll get back to the word balanced. But if you're going to use early and late, this typically is the split that you're talking about. Now, I can talk about bimodality, and it doesn't come up a lot, but if you're going to talk about bimodal bilingualism, you're talking about people who are bilingual in at least one signed language. So modality, this word is method of communication, right? Like mode. And so there are at least 3: signed mode, spoken mode, written mode. And when we talk about bimodal bilinguals, we're talking about people who are bilingual in at least one sign and at least one spoken. And there's some really interesting research for bimodal bilingualism, like you get co-articulation where I can talk and I can sign at the same time. And it's just really fertile ground because it's hard to find bimodal bilinguals. And then once you find them, it's hard to list the right data. But when you find it, it's really valuable. It's really, really interesting, kind of beyond what we're doing in this moment. But when we get back to bilingualism part 2 at the end of the semester with code switching, I'll bring it up again Because again, code switching is when you're using two languages in the same utterance, and if you can do it bimodally, it's even cooler. Heritage. So who typically uses this? I would say this is probably the broadest term in the sense of its most broad use. Okay. It's actually kind of specific, but its usage is pretty widespread among people who do really good technical work. So anyone who's studying bilinguals who don't necessarily have high proficiency in both languages will use the word heritage. Heritage sometimes gets thrown around when you want to talk about differences between early bilinguals and monolinguals. You know, a lot of times you'll see the word heritage pop up in those contexts. And we'll kind of break down the word heritage in the next slide because it's actually like you can use the word heritage in a few ways. Genitive SLAers typically pick this term. So myself, for example, I do use early and late from time to time, especially if I'm doing psycholinguistics. But you know, if I'm going to talk about grammar, I'm usually throwing around the word heritage. So what is it? Heritage, that word itself, is referring to exposure of a language in the home. Okay, very specifically, it's like home naturalistic context. It contrasts to people learning language outside of the home, outside of the family. So that in this use, when you use the word heritage, L2 is all that kind of classroom stuff. And typically heritage bilinguals have one home language and one language pertains to society at large, unless of course they've got that one guardian, one language thing going on. You know, there's two different languages per guard, like one guardian has one language and one has the other. Yeah. But heritage actually has kind of these different ways of using the term. Like I could talk about heritage learners, for example. The term heritage learner tends to be agnostic in terms of ability to use the language. It typically is the word we use in a classroom study because they're in a classroom, so they're a learner, right? And heritage learners also could, in theory, be receptive bilinguals where they don't talk or sign, right? They just understand. A heritage signer, and they can be deaf heritage signers or they can be hearing heritage signers. Usually people talk about heritage signers. They're typically talking about the child of deaf adult or kid of deaf adult. Occasionally they're talking about people who are born deaf with cochlear implants. It depends on the actual scope of that particular article. But a heritage signer is someone who uses a sign language to some degree they learn in the home. And once again, we're not making claims about balancedness or proficiency. The term heritage is agnostic to that. It does not make a claim, right? There are heritage that are very, very bare bones, and there are heritage that, in the right context, pass for monolingual, right? And then heritage speaker, obviously, it does not apply to a signer, is someone who uses a spoken language to some degree to learn in their home. Now notice there's a parallelism there, right? The term heritage learner is broader, right? It can be a speaker, it can be a signer. But both heritage signer and heritage speaker is we're talking about someone who uses the language. A learner doesn't have to actually use it, okay? So the broadest here is heritage learner, but you can be a heritage signer or a heritage speaker if you want to be more specific and B, suggest usage, okay? So my last comment on balanced bilinguals, I've kind of suggested this already. This is a hypothetical concept, right? You can hypothetically be balanced in two languages, right? Seemingly, if you look into the research, all bilinguals are a little stronger in one language or the other, usually because they use one more or the other, okay? The thing about this is you can actually be stronger in one language in some contexts or vice versa, such as, so imagine you in your home or at church or other private spaces. And I mentioned church because it actually comes up occasionally, or you know, or whatever your space of worship would be. But that particular heritage language, you might use it more in that private space, in that space where you're with people who are in your personal circle, right? So the home is the classic example. I'm just trying to give you another example by saying church, but there are many, many more examples. But you know, so for example, people might in that particular context use it more. So my spouse, for example, when he was a kid, so he's a Korean heritage receptive. He went to church in Korean when he was a kid. So in that context, he didn't actually know the words in the English version when he got older and had to go to English version church when he went to church. And because he learned it in Korean, so you can be stronger in certain contexts. It can be context specific, right? They call that domains, right? An area of like, topics, like this could be church or this could be school or this could be shopping or this could be government or this could be home or whatever, domains. Okay. So the same person who, for example, at home uses ASL only might know they're, be really, really comfortable talking about family life in ASL. And then in school or in government buildings or whatever, they'd be more comfortable doing it in English because of what they always do. This fact that you get this domain specificity, this domain separation, I won't say specificity, separation, in itself makes it crazy to even talk about balance. How does that even make sense? If your usage is literally just different places, how can you possibly say whether one's stronger or not, right? Because I become dominant in this language in this context and dominant in this language in this context. The term balanced is a farce. It does not happen, right? There are people who are close. They're close. But honestly, if you make them identify with one or the other, they usually, certainly at least in certain contexts, feel a little more this or a little more that, okay? Because, people who are even in the neighborhood of being balanced bilinguals, certainly heritage people in general, they're bicultural, right? That's kind of how you become a heritage person of any sort, is you're bicultural. You have more than, at the very least, you have my home and everybody else in the society, right? Or it could be in my home, there's two cultures, or it could mean there's two here and one out there, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, okay? So the concept of a balanced bilingual it's not real, okay? So just for a second, I'm going to return to the terms early and late bilingualism and whether bilingual is really a bigger umbrella or not. Does it really include L2 to say bilingualism? And I'm going to say yes or no, okay? So bilingualism, as in the coexistence of two languages in one linguistic system, does include L2, right? If that is the scope we're taking, and there are certain types of research where that's valuable. That's why early and late bilingual in those contexts makes sense. You hear it more in psycholinguistics. However, if we're talking about bilingualism as in the simultaneous-ish acquisition of two or more languages, it doesn't include L2. So it depends on what your question is. If it's about coexistence, it does. If it's about age, it does not. Okay? Depends on your assumptions. All right. So finally, the second half of this is about modality, and I've got a couple slides on this. Modality, remember I talked about modality in bimodal bilingualism, but modality, of course, includes written, right? So signed, spoken, written are the three major ones. So I can ask a research question, which is this: what relationship is there between modality and type of bilingual? Because if you're a bimodal bilingual, this question almost doesn't make sense, right? But I mean, I could ask this question. I could say, do heritage learners and L2 learners perform differently in the oral modality? So if I'm a high proficiency L2 in something, and you put me next to a high proficiency heritage learner of that same language, are we going to perform the same in the spoken modality if it's a spoken language? Similarly, in the written modality, are we going to be similar or different? And then, of course, I could ask that same question about the signed modality. Now, most L2 heritage papers aren't looking at the signed modality for various reasons, including probably because the number of bimodal bilinguals is comparatively low, simply because there are so many spoken languages, right? And, and if bilingualism often arises with immigration, you have to get a very specific context of immigration, right? But there's simply just less people who are bimodal bilinguals. There's part of the reason why the research is just there's less of it, but also kind of makes it more valuable in that sense because we're getting a peek into stuff that's really hard to study. But I'll say a couple things about it in this presentation regardless. I was able to find at least one good sort of overview paper, and I'll point you to it when we get there. So oral, heritage versus L2, research repeatedly demonstrates an advantage for heritage learners over their L2 counterparts in oral production. Okay, so in a spoken language, the heritage learners have an advantage when they're speaking than L2s do. I mean, typically you get more target-like phonology. You get more target-like gender production if it's a gendered language. If you have clitics in that language, you get more target-like clitic placement. Notice that a lot of this heritage data is on languages, gender, clitics, sounds like Romance languages, because a lot of heritage language research is on Romance languages. You know, those of you who remember, I teach Spanish because my PhD is technically in Hispanic linguistics, but I mean, linguistics is linguistics is linguistics. It just happened to be that we did a lot more work with it. But honestly, a lot of L2 and heritage work is on Spanish or languages around it. Again, there is other stuff. You know, we talked about a paper with Chinese in the Q6 class, but so a lot of the heritage stuff, guess what? It's Romance languages, a heck ton of it. And so, you know, if you guys want to be researchers, go forth. There are questions to be asked. And again, there's most of it's in Spanish. Most of it, not all of it, but certainly more than half. Montreal, who's going to get cited a lot because she's one of the foremost heritage researchers, is from Argentina. You know, so okay. So despite these things I say, they have some advantages over L2s. Heritage learners are still displaying morphological errors even in speech, such as case marking. And since we're studying Spanish, it's the a personal, if you happen to know what that is. But regardless, case marking is more broad. You know, it's a difference between he and him, and morphological things like that for heritage learners. Russian, this has been found too, right, are still challenging, right? So Russian heritage speakers, actually there's a Korean one I saw, right? It was like a transitivity marker that the heritage learners were still struggling with. Not that the L2s were doing better, it's just that it wasn't like it was monolingual like, okay? All right, written. So written, L2 learners generally are found to have an advantage in written tasks, although this is less studied overall. So heritage, once again, they have less target-like written use of gender, even though they can produce them in oral. And there's more variance among heritage speakers with respect to recognizing gender in a written task. Again, Montreal, because you know it's not as broadly studied because it's hard. It's actually harder to find a heritage learner than it is an L2. So think about it. L2 can be hard to find, but not too bad. Heritage harder. Bimodal bilingual even harder. Right? So that actually predicts how much research there is in it. How easy it is to find participants and have access to them, no less. Okay, so there's more variance. And in fact, heritage learners don't always show knowledge of some of the grammar types that are pretty school taught, which is to say they usually pertain to the written modality only. Jason Rothman did I think it was something about inflected infinitives in Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, and he showed that they didn't know it. The heritage kids didn't know it, period. And obviously the L2s did because they learned them in class. All right, so just to kind of summarize what I said, and you'll see it here with about modality specifically. Here is a sample piece of data or chart with some data points. From Montreal 2011. Seriously. Maria Polinsky is another one. She does Russian sometimes. Anyway, so here, just to orient you to this figure, the left half, the first two clusters, are written tasks. The right half, or rather the right two clusters, are oral tasks. The darkest bars are native speakers, so monolinguals. The gray bars are heritage speakers, and the lightest bars are L2 learners. And I'm going to guess this is Spanish because, you know, that's where the data exists. And if you take a look at this, you're going to notice that L2 are doing better than heritage on written tasks in the first two set of columns, right? Light is high, so white is higher than gray here. And heritage are outperforming L2 on oral tasks in the far right, right? So gray is higher than white. You know, it's actually quite stark when you get over what they call mood, you know. Anyway, so the question we're going to ask real quick here too is, why would heritage learners do more poorly in the written modality? I mean, again, context is going to drive this. Heritage input is largely oral and or naturalistic for spoken languages. And L2 input is largely written, largely from the classroom. So why would they not have an, you know, why would they not have an advantage? Honestly, the things that the L2 learners have over heritage in this respect just tends to be literacy skills. But I learned it that way. That was their modality of learning. You know, there's a heck ton more writing in a traditional, you know, college spoken language class than anything else. Just a ton. Written exams, written samples, written everything. Okay? All right. So signed, to the extent that there is data on heritage signers, um, you know, heritage and L2 aren't directly compared very much in signed languages. There is some data on discourse, like pronouns versus null, you know, but it's sparse. But there is some data about heritage signers in general. It's usually compared to deaf native signers. So there's some evidence of deaf native signer-like syntax, and this is the paper I'm talking about with the overview. Chen, Pitchley, Lamartin, and Palmer, 2018. The ref is in the work cited of this presentation, so go grab it. It's a decent paper. It's pretty readable. Covers a couple different like modules of language, does like phonology and stuff. To the extent that stuff is known, and this is pretty recent, this kind of covers their bases. Okay. There is anecdotal evidence for phonology of deaf native signer-like phonology, and if you don't know signed languages enough to know what that means, phonology is we're talking about organization of features in production, position, motion, there's stuff on the face. Okay, this is phonology for a signed language, and so there's anecdotal evidence of deaf native signer-like phonology in papers like these. But the reason why that's anecdotal is people make claims of heritage signers being mistaken for native deaf signers. I think at least one of these papers are talking about interpreters. So, but again, what's known about heritage signers is pretty sparse. They're hard to, I mean, for obvious reasons, you don't want to go in and disrupt people's lives. People it has to make sense for them, for us to study them. So there just hasn't been as much access to this. And part of it too is because traditionally it's been harder for people who are either non-hearing or so deaf or hard of hearing or whatever. It's harder for them to access academia. And so it's harder for the people with the right contacts to get into this research, right? In the same sense that you're going to have a lot more professors that are native speakers of Spanish than you are going to have professors that are native speakers of German. Ergo, there's less research in the US, certainly, from people who are Germans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's all about who's doing the research. So if you want more of this research, people who either are high proficiency in a sign language and know people who are, deaf or hard of hearing, et cetera, who are in this community, contact is necessary if you want this research to grow, So part of it's an equity issue, getting people who deserve to be in academia into academia instead of unnaturally barred. Anyway, so summary, different categorizations of bilinguals reflect assumptions of age of acquisition and context of acquisition. Bilinguals differ by modality. There's a role of context and type of input. Which is to say that context of where you became bilingual, if you use bilingual in the broadest sense, and what kind of input you had in that context will affect how strong you are in different modalities. All right, so we're excited. Send me questions and we'll chat on Monday.